Hi there. Welcome to Night Scares Begins. Before we start tonight's story, I want you to tell me where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Because no matter where you are, if you're hearing this past midnight, you've already let something follow you into the dark. Also, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy tonight's stories. Now, dim the light, pull up your blanket, and let's begin our evening together. It happened a few winters ago in rural Alaska, where the dark feels heavier, almost physical. I'd taken a seasonal job maintaining a remote research cabin, basically checking fuel levels, clearing snowfall, and making sure the pipes didn't freeze. The place sat miles away from the nearest road, surrounded by woods that felt endless. People always say Alaska is beautiful, and it is, but they don't talk enough about how isolated it can make you feel. Like the world has shrunk to whatever your lantern can reach. On that particular night, the cold felt sharper than usual. I kept thinking the temperature had dropped faster than the forecast predicted. The windows started frosting over from the inside, and every breath felt like it took a tiny piece of warmth out of me. Still, everything seemed normal enough. I made some tea, sat by the tiny heater, and tried to read, even though I could barely concentrate. There was this constant sense that something was off. Not dramatic, just a small pressure in the back of my mind, like the air was too still. Around midnight, the floorboards let out a long, slow groan behind me. The cabin was old, so creaking wasn't unusual. But this felt different. It stretched on for several seconds, as if someone was putting their weight on one particular plank. I turned around slowly, telling myself it was the cold shifting the wood. But that didn't stop my heartbeat from picking up. I could hear my pulse in my ears, steady but too fast. Then came the breathing, soft, almost steady, but not mine. It sounded like it was coming from the far corner of the room. The dark part the lantern couldn't reach. I held my breath to be sure, and the other breathing kept going, slow and deep, like someone trying not to be noticed. My throat felt tight, and I remember gripping the arm of the chair so hard my fingers hurt. I tried convincing myself that I was imagining it, that maybe I'd picked up the rhythm of the wind through the trees or something. But I'd lived out there long enough to know the difference. This was close, inside. I stood up, legs trembling a bit, and the breathing stopped instantly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the cold outside. I could feel the cabin watching me, if that makes sense, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. That's when I realized the lantern light seemed dimmer than before, flickering just slightly. And the dark corner looked deeper now, almost like the shadows were pulling inward, making space for something. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but outside was nothing but snow, darkness, and miles of forest. I kept telling myself, just check, just look, don't jump to conclusions. I took one step toward the corner, then another. By the third step, my breathing had gone shallow, and every part of me felt tense, ready to bolt. But I forced myself forward anyway, because not knowing felt worse than whatever might be waiting there. As I got close enough for the lantern to touch the edge of the shadows, something shifted, not loudly, not violently. Just the faintest movement, like someone adjusting their position to watch me better. I froze, and then I saw it. At least I think I did. I didn't get a clear look, just the outline of something that shouldn't have been there. A shape too tall, too narrow, as if a person had been stretched upward in ways a spine shouldn't allow. For a split second, the lantern light brushed against what might have been a shoulder, or maybe just a shift in the shadows themselves. Whatever it was, it pulled back before the light could touch more of it, almost like it was avoiding being seen. My chest tightened, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I stepped back, slowly at first, then faster. My heartbeat was so loud it felt like it filled the entire cabin. I kept waiting for that breathing to start again, but the silence stayed thick and unmoving. It somehow made everything worse, like the cabin was waiting to see what I would do next. I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door, my fingers stiff and clumsy. I wasn't even thinking about running outside. I just needed something between me and the open room. I kept looking toward that corner, expecting it to shift again, expecting something to emerge now that I'd backed away. But the shadows stayed still. I took a few shallow breaths and tried to convince myself the cold was getting to me. Isolation can mess with your senses. Maybe I'd been half asleep. Maybe the lantern was flickering in a way that made the shadows look alive. I told myself every excuse I could come up with, repeating them in my head like a mantra, trying to slow down my breathing. I finally forced myself to sit on the edge of the bed. The mattress springs creaked under me, and the sound cut through the silence like a warning. I flinched at it, which made me feel stupid, but the fear was still sitting heavy in my stomach. After a few minutes, I reached for the lantern, intending to turn the flame up a little. More light felt like the only comfort I could control. But as soon as my hand touched the lantern, the flame fluttered. Just once, like something had moved behind me, close behind me. I didn't turn around right away. I couldn't. My ears strained for anything. Breathing, movement, a shift in the floorboards. Nothing came. Just my own breath, uneven and too quick. When I finally forced myself to turn, there was nothing there. Just the narrow space between the bed and the wall. The air felt colder, though, as if someone had been standing there only seconds before and slipped away the moment I looked. I stayed awake for hours, too afraid to lie down, too afraid to close my eyes. Every time the lantern flickered, every time the cabin groaned under the weight of the cold, my muscles would tense. My mind kept going back to that shape in the corner, the way it had pulled back quickly, as if it understood the boundaries of the light, as if it knew the exact distance it needed to keep to remain unseen. Sometime near dawn, exhaustion finally pushed me to lie down. I didn't sleep, but I hovered in that hazy space between waking and dozing, the kind where every sound feels too close and every shadow feels too deep. And that's when I heard it again. Not a strange word, not anything I'd been trying to avoid, just breathing, slow, steady, unmistakably human. But this time, it was right beside the bed. I didn't open my eyes at first. I couldn't. The breathing was so close, I could feel the faint shift of air against my cheek, warm in a way that told me it was no trick of the wind. My pulse thudded painfully in my chest, each beat tight and uneven. I tried to steady it, but the more I focused, the louder it seemed to get, until it felt like the whole cabin must have heard it. I kept still, barely daring to inhale, terrified that any movement would confirm to whatever was beside me that I was awake. The thin blanket felt useless, like a flimsy barrier that offered no real protection. I remember counting the breaths, its breaths, trying to figure out a rhythm, trying to understand anything about it. But there was nothing steady about it now. It sounded almost cautious, like it was studying me. I finally opened my eyes just enough to see a sliver of the room. The lantern, nearly burned out, cast the faintest glow, flickering weakly. The corner where I'd seen that narrow shape hours earlier was swallowed in darkness again. But the space beside the bed, I could sense it more than I could see it. A presence leaning over me, waiting. I couldn't stay like that. My chest felt too tight, my body trembling under the effort of keeping still. So I forced myself to turn, slow and controlled, ready to face whatever was there. There was nothing. No shape leaning over me, no shift in the mattress, no retreating shadow. But the air was still warm against my cheek, as if something had pulled away only a moment before. I sat up fast, the blanket falling to my lap, breath unsteady and too sharp. My eyes scanned every corner of the cabin, trying to catch even the smallest movement. But the room was empty, or at least it looked empty. The silence after that breathing stopped felt different from before, heavier, intentional. Like whatever had been beside me was still there, just farther back, watching from a place the dim lantern couldn't reach. The back of my neck prickled so intensely it hurt. I turned toward the door, wondering if I should run into the snow and take my chances in the freezing dark. Then I heard the floorboards strain softly near the far wall, just enough pressure to suggest a shift in weight. My breath froze in my chest. I slowly moved the lantern toward that side of the room, but the flame barely brightened. The shadows didn't pull away this time. They felt fixed, almost solid. And then, as I stared into that darkness, something changed. Not a sound, not a movement, just a feeling, a sudden realization that I wasn't looking at the dark. I was looking into something. The way you look into a doorway before someone steps through it. I backed toward the exit without taking my eyes off that corner. My boots were already by the door, and I shoved my feet into them without bothering to lace them. My hands shook so badly, I fumbled with the latch twice before I finally ripped the door open and stepped out into the freezing air. The cold hit me so hard, it felt like my lungs seized, but it was still better than staying inside. I kept walking until the cabin disappeared behind the trees, until the first dull light of morning brushed against the snow. Only then did I stop. When I eventually returned with help several days later, the cabin looked the same. Nothing disturbed, nothing broken, nothing out of place. But I noticed one thing immediately. The corner where I'd seen the shape was darker than the rest of the room, even in full daylight. Like the shadows were clinging to it. I never spent another night there. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed back home, surrounded by people, traffic, lights, I swear I still hear that slow breathing beside me, close enough that it warms the side of my face. I tell myself it's memory. I tell myself it followed me only in thought. But on some nights, I feel the air shift. Story 2. At the time, I was house-sitting a remote cabin in Alaska for a friend who worked seasonal shifts. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small A-frame structure surrounded by miles of spruce and snow-covered slopes. The nearest neighbor was far enough away that you wouldn't see their cabin lights unless the sky was completely moonless. And even then, it was just the faintest speck. The first 2 nights were uneventful, quiet in that unnerving way Alaska can be, where the silence feels almost alive. I had a wood stove, a few battery lanterns, and a shortwave radio that barely picked up anything but static. I'd brought books to keep me company, but the stillness made it hard to focus. Every little sound felt amplified, the faint creak of the rafters, the shifting of ice on the roof, the soft crunch of snow settling outside. My heartbeat always felt just a little too loud, like it was trying to match the rhythm of the quiet around me. On the 3rd night, the wind had died completely. I didn't realize how much comfort the wind gave me until it wasn't there anymore. Without it, the silence felt heavier, almost pressurized. I remember lighting a lantern and setting it on the table while I made some tea. The flame flickered for a moment, casting brief shadows across the ceiling beams, before settling into a steady glow. I was halfway through pouring the water when I heard footsteps outside, slow and dragging, like someone was moving across the porch with deliberate effort. The cabin had a small front deck, nothing but wooden planks, and the sound carried clearly. I froze, the kettle still in my hand, steam rising into my face. My first thought was that it might be a moose, but the pattern didn't match. Moose are heavy. You feel their weight through the ground. This sounded human and too controlled. I waited, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped right at the door. My heart hammered hard enough that it hurt. I could feel each beat in my throat. I tried to listen for anything else, breathing, movement, even the faint groan of someone shifting their weight, but the silence pressed against the walls again. I didn't get up. I didn't speak. I just stood there, staring at the door like I could somehow see through it. After a long moment, the lantern flickered again. This time, the flame dipped low as though something had moved between it and the air feeding it. I swallowed hard, forcing myself not to panic. And then I heard it, a faint whisper. Not words, not anything clear. Just the sound of something exhaling softly, like it was inches from the wooden door, as if testing the air inside the cabin. I didn't move for what felt like forever. My hands were shaking so badly I set the kettle down before I dropped it. My breath felt shallow, like I couldn't inhale fully, no matter how hard I tried. Eventually, the whisper faded. Then the footsteps returned, softer than before, heading away from the porch and into the snow. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening, waiting for them to come back. But the worst part was the next morning, because when I opened the door, the snow was untouched. No prints, no trail, nothing, just smooth, undisturbed white. I stood there for a long time, staring at the untouched snow. The cold bit into my skin, but I barely felt it. My mind kept replaying the sound from the night before. Those slow steps, that faint whisper against the door. I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it, that maybe the cabin had shifted or the wood had settled in a way that mimicked footsteps, but nothing could explain that soft exhale. Nothing could explain how human it had sounded. I spent most of the day trying to distract myself, splitting wood, checking the fuel, even sweeping the porch, which felt ridiculous out in the middle of nowhere. Every time I stepped back inside, I felt eyes on me, like something had been watching through the windows while I worked. My thoughts kept looping. If there were no footprints, then how did it move? If nothing was there, then why did the lantern react? By late afternoon, clouds had rolled in, turning the sky a dull gray. The temperature dropped fast, sharper than usual. Inside the cabin, the air felt strangely cold, even with the stove burning. I tried to convince myself it was just the weather shifting, but the cold seemed to settle in certain spots, corners of the room, places where the lantern light didn't quite reach. When evening came, I lit both lanterns, hoping more light would make me feel safer. It didn't. If anything, the extra light only made the shadows seem deeper, like the brightness pushed them farther into the corners where they pooled and thickened. I kept glancing at the door, listening for the smallest sound. My heartbeat was already too fast, like it was preparing itself for something before my mind caught up. I told myself I wouldn't panic this time, that I needed to stay rational. But as the hours passed, the silence grew heavier again, dense, almost suffocating. I was sitting at the small table when I heard the floor creak behind me. Just one long, slow stretch of wood, like someone was shifting their weight carefully. I froze, my breath hitched in my throat. I tried not to turn around too quickly. Some instinct told me that whatever was behind me was close, maybe closer than the night before. I swallowed hard. The creaking stopped. The room went still. I forced myself to look over my shoulder. There was nothing there. just the back wall, dim and uneven in the lantern glow. But the air, it felt colder near that spot. My skin prickled. The tiny hairs on my arms lifted like they were reacting to an unseen presence. I got up slowly and moved toward the stove, pretending I needed to adjust the fire. The whole time, my chest felt tight, my breathing shallow. I hated turning my back on the room. Every second felt like something was waiting for me to slip, waiting for me to look away long enough to come closer. As I crouched by the stove, the lantern closest to the wall flickered. Not a normal flicker either. It dimmed so low I thought it was about to go out completely. The corners of the room darkened instantly, swallowing the space behind me in shadow. Then, just barely audible over my own shaky breath, I heard it again. A whisper. Not words, not language, just that same soft exhale, as if something was standing a few feet behind me, leaning close enough that I should have felt its breath on my back. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Because this time, the whisper didn't fade. It moved. Slowly. Deliberately. I stayed crouched by the stove, every muscle tense, my fingers gripping the metal handle so hard they hurt. The whisper drifted just behind me, rising and falling like someone was breathing in slowly, then letting the air slip out through barely parted lips. My heartbeat felt uneven, like it couldn't decide whether to race or stop completely. Each breath I took felt too loud, like I was giving myself away. The warmth of the stove barely reached me. The air at my back felt cold in a focused way, like a presence was leaning close enough to chill the space around my spine. I kept my eyes on the small flame through the grate, watching it quiver as if reacting to whatever stood behind me. I forced myself to stand. I moved slowly, trying not to provoke anything, trying to pretend I didn't feel the air shifting around me. When I finally straightened fully, the whisper stopped. The silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt expectant, like something was watching to see what I'd do next. I turned just enough to see the rest of the cabin. The far lantern glowed weakly. The corners looked darker than any natural shadow should be. My breath came out uneven, fogging slightly in the cold air. I focused on the door, on the simple metal latch keeping me inside. I started moving toward it one step at a time. My boots barely made a sound on the wooden floor, but every step felt enormous in the stillness. I kept expecting to hear the whisper again, or the creak of a board behind me, or the faint brush of something following, but nothing came. I reached the door and wrapped my shaking fingers around the latch. Just before I lifted it, the lantern closest to the wall flickered again, once, twice, and then steadied. The shadows in the corner shrank back slightly, like they had been closer a moment before, and were retreating just out of sight. I didn't look long. I forced the door open and stepped outside into the freezing air. The cold hit me hard, but at least it felt natural, not like the focused chill that had been inside. I walked down the steps and into the snow, my breath clouding in front of me. I didn't stop walking until I reached the tree line. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see a figure on the porch or a shape framed in the doorway. But the cabin stood still and silent, lanterns glowing faintly through the windows. In the morning, after I'd calmed down enough to think straight, I went back with the excuse of grabbing my gear. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it again. The cold spot near the back wall, the strange thickness in the air, the sense that someone had just moved out of sight. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing was out of place. But I noticed a faint circle of frost on the inside of the cabin window, about the height of a person's face. Almost as if someone had stood there for a long time, breathing slowly, watching the room. I left before finishing packing. Sometimes, usually late at night, I think about that whisper, how close it was, how it followed the tiny sounds of my breathing. And every now and then, when I'm drifting off to sleep, I hear something faint in the quiet of my room. Not words, not even a sound I could clearly describe. Just a soft exhale. Slow, steady, like it finally found me again. Story 3. I'll never forget that night. Even saying it now makes my chest tighten a little, like my body still remembers the cold before my mind does. This happened a few winters ago when I was staying in a remote part of Alaska for a seasonal job. I wasn't alone there, at least that's what I kept telling myself. But the isolation was the kind that wears you down slowly. Long nights, long stretches of silence, and miles of snow that seemed to swallow sound instead of carrying it. The cabin I stayed in was small, only one room with a loft area I never used. The floors creaked in certain spots, always the same ones, so I learned the rhythm of the place quickly. The first week went fine. The usual cold drafts, the odd groan from the wood contracting, nothing unusual. But on the 8th night, something shifted. It started with the lantern. I had it sitting on the table while I tried reading to pass the time. The flame flickered lightly. Normal, I thought, but then it dimmed as though something had pressed too close to it, blotting out the air. I leaned in, wondering if it needed adjusting, but before I could touch it, I felt a faint sweep of cold air pass behind me. Not from the door, not from a window, from inside the room. I turned around slowly, trying not to startle myself, telling my heart to stop racing. But there was nothing, just the cabin's far wall, the shelves with dried food, the stove. Still, the room felt different, heavy, like I'd stepped into someone else's space without realizing it. After a minute, I sat back down and tried to calm my breathing. I told myself the cold could play tricks on a person. But I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling a strange pressure at the back of my neck, as if someone was standing just outside my field of vision. A little later, I heard the floorboard shift behind me. Not loudly, not suddenly, just a slow, drawn-out creak that made my skin crawl instantly. The kind of sound you hear when someone carefully places their weight on a board, trying not to be noticed. My throat tightened. I didn't turn around. I don't know why. Fear, I guess. Fear that if I looked, I'd actually see someone standing there. My breathing stayed shallow, and I felt my pulse thumping in my temples. I waited for another sound, anything to prove it wasn't just my nerves. Instead, I heard a faint whisper. Not a voice, not words, just a breath. So soft I almost thought it was my own. But it wasn't. It came from somewhere near the wall behind me, too far from my mouth to be an echo or trick of sound. Then the lantern dimmed again. I finally stood up, slow and cautious, like the air around me might shatter. My legs felt weak, and I realized I had been tensing them for minutes without noticing. I took one small step toward the center of the room, then another. The creaking stopped, the whispering faded, and the cold concentrated in one spot near the corner, like someone had been standing there seconds earlier. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against the wall, watching the cabin until morning, waiting for something else to move. And when the dawn finally came, something had changed in the snow outside. Something I couldn't explain. When the first light crept through the frosted windows, I finally worked up the courage to open the door. The cold hit me immediately, sharp enough to sting. But what froze me in place wasn't the temperature. It was the snow. The night before, the snowfall had been heavy. I should have seen a smooth, fresh layer covering everything. But right there in front of the cabin, the snow was disturbed. Not footprints exactly, nothing that clear, but long, shallow impressions, like something had dragged across the surface without fully touching it. The marks curved slightly, stopping just a few feet from the porch. Then they simply ended. No trail leading away, no sign of what made them. Just those strange, deliberate arcs in the snow. My stomach tightened, and for a moment I truly thought about packing everything and leaving. But the closest road was miles away, and I didn't trust myself to make the hike in that state of mind. I spent most of the morning inside, forcing myself to focus on chores just to keep my hands busy. Even so, I kept glancing at the door, expecting it to open on its own. As the day went on, the unease grew instead of fading. I started noticing other things too. Small, subtle things I could have easily missed. The air inside the cabin seemed colder near the back wall, enough that my breath came out faintly, even though the stove was burning steadily. The lantern flame swayed gently at times, like someone was passing by, though nothing moved. By late afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Whenever I turned my back to the room, the hairs on my neck rose. My heartbeat felt quicker, like my body sensed something my mind couldn't see. I kept wiping my palms on my jeans without realizing they were sweating. When night fell, the silence grew thick again. It felt heavier than before, as if the dark outside was pushing against the walls. I lit the lanterns earlier than usual, trying to make the cabin feel warmer, but the light only created deeper shadows in the corners. Around midnight, I heard the first creak. It came from the loft above me, slow, steady, the sound of weight settling onto old boards. I stared up at the dark opening above the ladder, my pulse hammering so hard it felt like each beat shook my ribs. I told myself over and over, the loft is empty. You never put anything up there. But the creaking continued, soft, spaced apart, like someone was shifting their position just enough to test the boards. I backed away from the ladder, breathing shallow and uneven. My hands trembled, and I could feel each tremor echoing through my chest. The shadows at the top of the loft looked thicker now, almost like they were hiding something tall, something still. The creaking stopped, but a moment later I heard something else, a faint whisper from above, drifting down through the darkness. Not words, just the slow release of breath. My vision blurred for a moment from how fast my heart was pounding. Then the lantern nearest the ladder flickered, dimmed, and stayed low as though something was blocking part of its light. I didn't move, couldn't move. And then, one final sound. A soft, careful shift of weight on the boards overhead, directly above where I was standing. I eased my way down the staircase, guiding myself by the curve of the handrail, as the air grew heavier, thick enough that breathing felt like pushing through unseen cloth. The dining room waited at the bottom like a held breath, silent, patient, watching. The chandelier above the center table flickered as I stepped into the room, sending shifting shadows swirling across the walls. Chairs that had been neatly arranged earlier were now angled toward the middle of the room, as if an audience expecting a performance. And in the middle of the table sat the small porcelain bell, the same bell the host had used at the start of the evening, the one he'd placed on a tray and carried back to the kitchen, the one I knew, absolutely knew, hadn't been here when I'd come upstairs. I moved closer, every step making the air cooler. The bell was spotless, too clean, like it had never been touched by a living hand. I reached out, hesitated, then placed my fingers around it. A voice drifted behind me, a woman's voice, soft, trembling, pleading. Please, don't let him in. I spun around so fast the bell slipped from my hand. No one was there. But the chairs had changed again. They all faced me now. My pulse hammered as I backed away. When my heel hit the bottom stair, something behind the table shifted. A figure, faint but real enough to make the room tilt. A tall silhouette, blurred at the edges like smoke, watching me from the far wall. The chandelier dimmed, the air tightened. The silhouette leaned forward, as if stepping out of a doorway I couldn't see. I didn't wait. I ran up the stairs, through the hall, and out the front doors. Cold air hit me like a shock as I stumbled into Jackson Square. The night was alive, bright, filled with people and sound, normal life continuing, unaware of whatever had reached for me inside that building. But as I turned back toward Muriel's, the second-floor balcony curtains fluttered. Someone, or something, stood behind them, watching. Exactly where I had stood only minutes before. And even from the street, with all the noise and light around me, a feeling followed. I hadn't escaped. I had been noticed. Story 4. I'd taken a seasonal job at a remote research cabin, north of Fairbanks. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet, isolated, and paid well enough to get me through the winter. Most people can't handle that kind of solitude. I thought I could. The nearest town was over an hour away, and the only light at night came from a dim porch lamp that barely cut through the endless snow. One evening, a storm hit harder than anything I'd seen before. Wind pushed against the walls like a restless animal. But inside, it was calm enough for me to relax by the small heater. I'd just settled into the creaky armchair when I felt something. An awareness. Like the sense you get when someone is standing behind you, even if you don't hear a sound. I brushed it off as nerves. Winter in Alaska does strange things to your mind, especially when you've been alone for days. I kept reading, trying to focus on the page in front of me, but the feeling didn't fade. It grew heavier, more present. I found myself glancing toward the hallway every few minutes, expecting to see, I don't know, something. Around midnight, the generator flickered. The lights dimmed to a low glow, barely enough to see the outlines of the furniture. My breath fogged in the cold air, and that's when I heard it. The faintest shift of the floorboards in the hallway. Not loud, not sharp, just the slow bending of wood under weight. My heartbeat spiked immediately. I sat frozen in the chair, breath shallow, ears straining for anything else. The cabin was supposed to be empty. No visitors, no animals inside. No reason, no explanation for someone or something to be standing in that hallway. I finally got up, forcing myself to move even though my whole body felt heavy with dread. The air in the hall was colder, as if the warmth had been pulled away. My footsteps felt too loud on the floor, and each one made my chest tighten. At the end of the hall was the storage room. The door was partially open. I knew I hadn't left it that way. My pulse was so fast it felt like it was rattling inside my chest. 1,000 thoughts raced through my head. Intruder, wild animal, exhaustion, messing with me. But none of them explained why the air felt watched. I reached for the door with a shaking hand, pushing it open just enough to peek inside. Nothing. Just shelves, boxes, and darkness. But the cold in that room. It felt unnatural, like stepping into a place where the air didn't belong to you. I stepped back and closed the door, swallowing hard. The sense of being watched didn't disappear. If anything, it concentrated behind me as if the moment I turned away, something else turned toward me. I thought about leaving the cabin for the truck. But the storm outside was brutal. Visibility was almost zero. If something was actually inside with me, running into that storm might have been the only worse option. I tried to steady my breathing, but it felt difficult, like the air itself had thickened around me. That was when I heard the next sound. Soft, steady, unmistakably close. Not from the hallway this time. From the room directly behind me. I froze. Every muscle in my body went tight, like my instincts were trying to hold me completely still. The room behind me was the tiny kitchen, a place I had just been in less than an hour earlier. Nothing had seemed unusual then, but now I could hear something inside it. A soft shift of weight, like fabric brushing lightly against a chair. Too slow, too controlled to be the wind. I didn't want to turn around. I remember that clearly. My breathing went shallow and fast, and I felt the cold air press into my lungs like it was trying to settle inside me. The quiet stretched out, long enough that it almost made me dizzy. Finally, I forced myself to turn my head, inch by inch. The kitchen was darker than it should have been. The generator was still running, but the light above the counter flickered at an uneven pace. I stepped closer, letting my eyes adjust, listening for anything that might explain what I'd heard. The air felt heavier in that room, almost thick, like it was brushing against my skin. When I reached the doorway, I noticed the chair at the small wooden table. It was pulled out slightly. Not much, just an inch or two, but I knew for a fact I had pushed it in all the way earlier. Living alone makes you pay attention to little details because there's no one else who could have changed them. I told myself maybe I'd forgotten, but the feeling in my stomach said otherwise. I reached out and pushed the chair back in. As soon as my hand left it, the cold in the room seemed to tighten around me again. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears I could barely hear anything else. My mind kept replaying what I thought I'd heard. The small shift, the soft scrape. Something had been standing in this room, or sitting. A sudden dimming of the lights pulled me back. The flicker was stronger this time, long enough to cast the kitchen into near darkness before the bulb steadied again. That was when I noticed something on the counter. A thin line of frost had formed along the edge of the wooden surface, spreading slowly, like tiny crystals growing across the grain. The heater was working, and the rest of the cabin wasn't nearly that cold. I felt my breath come faster, clouding in front of me even though it shouldn't have. The silence in the room deepened. It wasn't empty. I could feel that intensely. It was the same sensation you get when you walk into a place where someone's already been standing for a while. The faint trace of presence, of attention. The hairs on the back of my neck rose, and the thought hit me so clearly it almost felt spoken. Whatever had been in the hallway wasn't gone. It had just moved. I backed up slowly, my hands trembling even though I was trying to keep them steady. I didn't take my eyes off the kitchen until I was out of the doorway, back into the dim living room where the air felt just slightly warmer, but not safer. The sense of being watched followed me. It didn't let up, not even for a second. I turned toward the hallway again, trying to decide whether to grab my coat and make a run for the truck, storm or not. The wind outside howled against the roof, but compared to the silence inside, it almost felt welcoming. Then, from deeper in the cabin, I heard something change. Not a word, not an animal, not anything I could explain. Just the faintest distortion of air, like someone slowly pulling a long, deep breath. Not mine. I stood there, frozen, listening. The breathing wasn't close, but it wasn't far either, somewhere down the hallway that led to my bedroom. Slow, steady, deliberate. Like something was waiting for me to follow the sound, to walk toward it. My chest tightened so hard I had to force myself to inhale. The air tasted metallic, the way it does right before a storm gets worse. I could feel my pulse in my throat, fast and uneven, and every part of me wanted to run. But the only exit was past the hallway, past the place where that slow inhaling drifted from. I stayed still, hoping the breathing would fade, or that I'd realize it was just my imagination. It didn't fade. If anything, it grew quieter, like whatever was making the sound had become aware that I was listening. I took a careful step backward, feeling for the edge of the couch behind me. My hand brushed the worn fabric, grounding me for a moment. I kept imagining someone, or something, standing just inside my bedroom doorway, chest rising and falling, waiting for me to come closer. Another flicker rolled through the lights. This time they dimmed so low that the entire cabin fell into a dull, shadowy blur. I felt something inside me snap. The fear was no longer creeping through me. It was flooding everything at once. I grabbed my coat from the hook near the door, fingers shaking, eyes fixed on that dark hallway. The breathing didn't follow me, but the cold did. It swept through the room in a slow wave, brushing across my face, as if something had moved closer without making a sound. I didn't look back. I yanked the front door open and stepped into the storm. The wind hit me with such force it almost took my breath away, but even that felt better than the heavy, suffocating air inside. I hurried toward my truck, boots sinking deep into the snow. The engine protested the cold before finally starting, and as the headlights washed over the cabin, I felt a pull in my stomach telling me not to look at the windows. I looked anyway. In the second-story window, the one from my bedroom, I saw a shape. Not a figure, not clearly. Just a darker patch of darkness, standing impossibly still. Watching. The kind of stillness nothing living could hold. The lights inside the cabin flickered behind it, faintly, like they were responding to whatever was there. I pressed the gas and didn't stop until the cabin was just a small glow disappearing behind the snowfall. I didn't go back for the rest of the season. When I finally returned in the spring to pack up what was left, the power was out, the heater was off, and the place had warmed with the sun. But the frost line was still there on the kitchen counter, perfectly shaped, perfectly preserved, like a handprint left behind by something that hadn't stepped out of the cabin when I did. Sometimes, late at night, when everything's quiet and the air around me suddenly chills for no reason, I get the same feeling I had in that hallway in Alaska, like a breath is being drawn in the dark behind me, slow and patient, waiting. Story 5. I didn't plan on staying the winter in Alaska. It just sort of happened. One delayed flight, one cheap rental cabin, and the kind of stubborn pride that makes you say, "I'll be fine," even when every local warns you that you won't. The cabin sat about 40 minutes outside Fairbanks, right at the edge of a tree line that looked endless, especially at night. The air felt thicker there, quieter in a way that made you too aware of your own breathing. The first nights were uneventful. Cold, lonely, but quiet. I'd lie under the heavy blankets listening to the old wooden frame settle, the rafters stretching with the temperature changes. At first the sounds blended into the wind, nothing unusual. But one night, I remember this too clearly, the boards under the living room shifted in a slow, steady way. Almost like footsteps, but softer, as if whoever or whatever made them was trying to move carefully. I sat up in bed, listening. My heart was already beating faster just from the silence that followed. You know how your ears strained to fill the quiet? Mine were doing that, like they were waiting for something to continue. I held my breath without meaning to, just trying to figure out if I really heard what I thought I did. Then the floor creaked again. Not loud, not dramatic, just one long, slow shift of weight somewhere near the center of the cabin. I told myself it was the wood contracting from the cold. I told myself that like 5 times. But the thing is, wood contraction doesn't usually sound rhythmic. It doesn't usually sound like it's moving from one board to the next. That night, I didn't go check. I just sat there, back against the headboard, staring at the open doorway leading to the living room. The dim light from the heater cast this faint orange glow on the wall, just enough to see shadows, but not enough to feel safe. The sound stopped eventually, but I didn't sleep. I stared until the light outside shifted from black to gray, and only then did I get up and walk through the cabin. Nothing was out of place. The floorboards looked normal. Even the air felt normal. Cold, still, empty. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing just out of view. I told myself I'd get used to the sounds, that the cabin was old, that Alaska had its own voice at night. I tried to convince myself I wasn't losing it from the isolation. But the next night, things got worse. The next night, the temperature dropped hard. I could feel it even inside, the way the air bit at my nose and fingertips when I stepped away from the heater. I layered up and tried to distract myself with a book, but every few minutes my eyes drifted toward the window. The trees outside were barely visible, just black shapes swaying against darker shadows. Around midnight, the lights in the cabin flickered. Not fully off, just that dimming that makes your stomach tighten, because you know you're too far from help if they go out, completely. When they steadied again, the room felt different, heavier, like the air pressed closer to my chest. I tried to breathe slowly, but each inhale sounded louder than it should have. Too loud. Like I wasn't the only one breathing in that room. I told myself to get it together. I stood, walked into the kitchen, and poured water into a cup just to give myself something to do. But even with my back turned, I felt it. That slow shift of weight on the floorboards behind me. Not abrupt, just a subtle movement. Like someone testing how quietly they could stand. My hands started shaking. I didn't turn around right away. Stop. I just stared at the cup, watching the water ripple from the tremor in my fingers. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, each thud stronger than the last. For a moment, I actually thought I might pass out. When I finally forced myself to look, there was nothing behind me. Just the dim kitchen, the narrow hallway, the living room beyond it. Empty. Except the shadows on the far wall looked different than before. Not stretched from the heater, not shaped like furniture. Taller, narrower. As if someone had been standing there and stepped away the moment I turned. I stared so long, my eyes started to burn. The shadow didn't move again, and I tried to convince myself I just imagined it. But my chest felt tight, and I could hear my own breathing getting shorter, faster, almost shaky. I decided to sleep with the lights on. I laid down fully dressed, boots near the edge of the bed, just in case I needed to run out into the cold night, even though I had no idea where I'd run to. For a while, nothing happened. I listened to the heater hum, the distant wind, the soft rustle of the blanket when I shifted. Then came the whisper. It wasn't a word, more like breath-forming sound, faint and thin, drifting from the living room. Just long enough to convince me I hadn't imagined it. Just soft enough to make my skin crawl. I sat up, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The whisper came again, barely audible, like someone exhaling right into the doorway. I didn't move for the rest of the night. By the time the sun came up, I felt drained, dizzy, strung out from fear and no sleep. I kept telling myself I'd leave that day, but I didn't. Because something strange happened that morning, something that made me hesitate. When daylight finally crept through the windows, I felt this wave of relief. Like whatever had been in the cabin slipped back into the shadows with the night. I got up, stretched my aching legs, and tried to shake the exhaustion off. I even laughed a little at myself, thinking maybe the isolation was getting to me more than I realized. Then I walked into the living room. At first, nothing looked unusual. Same old furniture, same cold floor, same pale light seeping through the frosted glass. But when I stepped farther in, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. There were footprints in the thin layer of frost that had formed near the door. Not boots, bare feet, long strides, deeper impressions than mine would have made. They led from the front door toward the hallway that connected to the bedroom. And the frost wasn't disturbed near the doorframe itself, which meant they didn't come from outside. They started inside the cabin. I stared at them so long I forgot to breathe. My heartbeat climbed into my throat, each pulse sharp and frantic. The footprints ended halfway to the bedroom, as if the person who left them had simply vanished mid-step. My first instinct was to run. Just grab my bag, get into the rental car, and leave everything behind. But the cabin felt like it was watching me. I know how that sounds, but that's the closest way I can describe it. The air felt alive, aware, almost waiting to see what I would do next. I forced myself to move slowly, like any sudden motion might draw attention. I packed only what was closest, my phone, my jacket, my keys, and edged toward the door. My breathing was uneven, shaky, loud in my ears. Every creak of the floor beneath me made my chest tighten. Right when I reached for the doorknob, the lights dimmed again. Not fully off, just enough for the shadows in the corners to stretch a little too far, a little too quickly. I froze, gripping the doorknob so hard my fingers hurt. That faint whisper drifted from behind me. It felt closer this time. Not from the living room, not from the hall, from just a few inches behind my shoulder. I didn't look. I yanked the door open and stepped outside into the biting cold, letting the air burn my lungs. I ran to the car, slipped on the ice, scrambled back up, and didn't stop until I was inside with the doors locked. My hands were shaking so violently I missed the ignition slot twice before getting the key in. When I looked up at the cabin, something stood in the window. A figure. Still. Unmoving. Watching. No features, just a dark shape where no shape should have been. I drove away so fast the tires slid across the frozen dirt, but I didn't care. I didn't slow down till I hit the main road. You'd think that's where the story ends, but there's something I haven't said yet. That footprint pattern, the length of the stride, the spacing, the shape, it matched mine. Not perfectly, but close. Like someone had studied how I walked and tried to copy it. As if whatever was in that cabin wasn't just watching me. It was learning me. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in my apartment trying to sleep, I swear I hear the floor shift in that same steady rhythm. Just soft, careful steps, moving from one board to the next. Story 6. I used to think Alaska was just cold and quiet. Nothing more. People talk about the wilderness like it's peaceful, like it's some place to clear your head. But the quiet there isn't peaceful. It's the kind that presses into your ears until you start hearing things that might not be there. I ended up renting a small place outside Anchorage for a month. A friend told me it'd be a good reset, a chance to get out of the city and breathe air that didn't smell like exhaust. The cabin wasn't fancy, just a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and wood floors that seemed older than the wiring. But I liked it the first night. The heater hummed, the lights buzzed, and the windows looked out over this endless sheet of trees dusted in white. The weird stuff didn't start until maybe the third night. I was getting ready for bed when the floorboards shifted in the living room. I'd heard them settle before, but this time it sounded different, more deliberate. Like the weight moved across the boards instead of just sagging with the cold. I remember freezing halfway through pulling off my sweater, waiting to hear it again. My heartbeat sped up before anything else even happened. Just that instinctive spike of adrenaline you get when you think someone else might be in the room with you. At first, nothing. The heater hummed. The light flickered once, then steadied. Then I heard another soft shift of the floor, a little farther from the first one, almost like someone taking a careful step. My breathing got shallow without me realizing. I kept telling myself it was just the temperature dropping. That old wood does this sort of thing. But the sound had a rhythm to it, a slow, creeping rhythm that made me want to hide under the blankets like I was a kid again. I edged toward the bedroom doorway and stared into the living room. It was dim, just a dull glow from the heater, casting jagged shadows across the floor. The air looked still, but I swear it felt like something was in there, like the space wasn't empty. I waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Eventually, I convinced myself it was in my head, forced myself to crawl into bed, and stared at the ceiling until my eyes finally grew heavy. But the moment I started drifting off, I heard something else. Breathing. Not loud, just a faint, steady inhale and exhale, coming from somewhere near the end of the bed. My eyes shot open, and I felt my pulse jump so fast it made my hands twitch. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just lay there listening to that slow, quiet breathing that wasn't mine. It stopped after a few seconds, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I spent the whole next day trying to convince myself I'd imagined everything. Lack of sleep can mess with you, especially in a place that gets dark as early as Alaska does. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more unsettled I felt. It wasn't just the sound. It was how my body reacted. That spike of panic, that tightness in my chest. It felt too real to be nothing. By the time evening came, I already dreaded being inside the cabin. The place looked the same as always, but the air felt off, heavy, like walking into a room right after someone leaves when their presence still lingers. Around 11, the lights started flickering again. Just short bursts, maybe a second or two, but each time the room dimmed, my heartbeat sped up. I kept glancing toward the corners of the living room, half expecting to see someone standing there. At one point, I swear I heard the faintest whisper. Not a voice saying a word, more like breath brushing against the air. It drifted from the hallway, so soft I almost missed it. But the sound made my skin crawl instantly. My breathing got shaky, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my neck. I walked to the kitchen to distract myself, pretending I needed water, but really I just wanted to move, to not feel like prey frozen in place. I kept my eyes on the worn wooden floor as I filled the glass, trying not to look toward the hallway. Then I heard it again, the floor shifting, slow, one board at a time, coming from the direction of the bedroom. My hands went cold. The glass trembled a little in my grip. I forced myself to turn around, every muscle tight, ready to bolt if anything moved. Nothing did. The hallway was empty. Just darkness and the faint reflection of the kitchen light on the floor. But the air there, it wasn't still. It felt disturbed somehow, like someone had just walked through it a moment before. I couldn't make myself go to the bedroom after that. I sat on the couch, fully dressed, shoes on, as if that tiny detail would somehow keep me safe. I kept the lights on and stared at the hallway until my eyes burned. Sometime near dawn, I heard breathing again. This time, it was behind the couch. Just a few slow inhales, so faint they almost blended with the heater's hum, but close enough to make my whole body tense. My heartbeat felt too fast, like it was trying to punch its way out of my chest. The breathing faded after a few seconds, but I stayed frozen until the sky brightened enough that I felt brave enough to move. That morning, something even stranger happened. Something that made me question if leaving would even help. When the first light hit the windows, I finally stood up from the couch. My whole body felt stiff, like I'd been bracing for something all night. I kept telling myself I'd pack up, get in the car, and drive back to town. I didn't even care about losing the deposit on the cabin anymore. I just wanted out. But the moment I stepped into the hallway, I stopped. On the floor, right in the thin layer of frost that had formed overnight near the back door, there were footprints. Bare footprints. Not mine. The shape was different, longer, narrower. The steps didn't come from outside either. They started in the middle of the hallway and led toward the bedroom. It looked like someone had just appeared there and walked slowly into the room where I'd heard the breathing the night before. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, hard and uneven. For a second, my vision blurred, like my brain was trying too hard to make sense of what I was seeing. My breathing got shallow again, and I had to force myself to inhale deeply just to stay steady. I told myself to leave everything behind and just go. But something about those prints pulled me toward the bedroom anyway. Not curiosity exactly. More like dread mixed with the need to confirm that nothing else was in there. When I reached the doorway, the room looked exactly like I left it. The blankets were still messy from the night before. The small lamp on the dresser was still tilted. The air felt colder in there, though, enough to make goosebumps rise on my arms. I walked in slowly, every step careful. The footprints stopped right beside the bed, right where I'd heard the breathing that first night. That was enough. I grabbed my coat, keys, and bag without even checking what I'd dropped or left behind. I didn't care. I just needed the door between me and that cabin. But when I reached for the front door, something happened that still messes with my head. The light beside me dimmed. Not flickering this time, just gradually fading. Like something was standing between me and the bulb. The shadow stretching along the floor didn't look like mine. It was taller, thinner. I could hear breathing again. Right behind me. Slow, steady, almost calm. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. I didn't turn around. I shoved the door open and stepped into the freezing air, letting the cold burn my lungs because it at least proved I was outside, away from whatever was in there. I didn't look back until I was already in the car. And when I finally did, I saw something through the cabin window. A shape. Just a silhouette. Standing exactly where I'd been a moment earlier. Still. Watching. I drove until I reached the main road. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe right until I saw other houses again. But here's the part I can't shake, even now. After I left, I checked the frost around my own car door. There were footprints leading up to it. Not human ones, not animal ones. Something in between. And later that night, when I was in my apartment hundreds of miles away, I woke up to the softest creak from the living room floor. Slow, careful. Like whatever had been in that cabin wasn't done following me. Story 8. I didn't grow up in a cold place, so the first winter I spent in Alaska hit me harder than I'd ever admit out loud. The kind of cold that doesn't just sting. It feels like it climbs under your clothes, settles on your spine, and waits. I had taken a seasonal job maintaining a remote lodge near the edge of a frozen inlet. It sounded peaceful, quiet, a chance to reset my life. But the quiet there wasn't comforting. It was the kind of quiet that made you focus on things you'd normally ignore. Your own breathing, the slow thud of your heartbeat, the way every board in the lodge seemed to protest the weather. I used to sit by the window at night, watching the snow swallow everything beyond the porch. Some nights the wind would scrape through the trees, and it almost sounded like someone walking far off in the dark, dragging their steps through the powder. It was early January when things shifted. The lodge had been empty for weeks. No visitors, no staff, just me. And I had settled into the routine of being completely alone. At least, I thought I was. I remember waking up around 3 in the morning, The kind of sudden waking where your whole body tenses before your mind catches up. My breath felt shallow, and for a second I couldn't tell if it was my heartbeat or the heater humming through the vents. There was a faint sound coming from the main hallway. Just a slow, steady rhythm, like someone moving one foot and then the other on the wooden floorboards. Not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. I held my breath, listening. The hallway light flickered the way it sometimes did when the generator struggled. The unsteady glow made the shadows stretch long across the floor, and I kept waiting for something to walk past my doorway, some shape, some hint of movement. But nothing did. I told myself it was the lodge settling again, the boards adjusting to the cold. But my body didn't believe that. My chest felt tight, my hands cold even under the blankets. I don't know how long I lay there staring at the doorway, but eventually the rhythm faded and the hallway went quiet again. I should have gotten up, checked it, proved to myself it was nothing. But I didn't. I just waited for morning. The next morning, the lodge felt colder than usual, like someone had left a door cracked open overnight. When I stepped into the hallway, the air felt heavier, almost damp, and I swear I could see the faintest mist when I exhaled. The heater was running, so there was no reason it should have felt that way. I checked every room anyway: kitchen, storage, utility closets, guest rooms with their unused beds and untouched blankets. Everything looked exactly the same. No open windows, no footprints in the snow outside. Nothing that explained the feeling that had crawled under my skin. I kept telling myself I was just tired, that isolation was getting to me. But that night, something happened that made it impossible to shrug off. I was in the lounge area reading by the fireplace, trying to distract myself with anything that wasn't the silence pressing in around me. The fire had burned down to slow, glowing embers, and the only other light was the weak lamp trembling every so often. That was when I heard breathing. Not mine. Not the soft, automatic breathing you stop noticing after a while. This was deeper, closer. I froze, holding my own breath without meaning to. The air felt tight against my chest as I listened, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It sounded like someone standing just behind the doorway that led into the lounge. Slow, steady inhales, each one just a little uneven, like they'd been walking through the cold. My hands started to shake. I stared at the doorway, waiting for a shadow to shift or a figure to appear. Nothing moved, but the breathing didn't stop. If anything, it grew clearer. I could almost feel the warmth of it, as if it were spilling into the room ahead of whoever it belonged to. I couldn't bring myself to stand. My legs felt heavy, rooted to the chair. All I could do was grip the armrests and try to keep my own breathing quiet. Then the lamp flickered hard enough that it went out for a moment, plunging the room into darkness. In that instant, I felt something, just a small shift of air, like someone passing close to the chair I was sitting in. The light snapped back on a second later, weak but steady. The doorway was empty. The breathing was gone. I sat there for what felt like an hour before I finally forced myself to move. I backed into my room, locked the door, and left the hallway light on, even though it barely helped. Every sound after that felt sharper. Every creak made my heartbeat stumble. And by the time the sun came up, I knew something was wrong with that place. I didn't plan on staying another night. I'd already packed most of my things by early afternoon, telling myself I'd head back to Anchorage before the weather turned worse. But as the hours passed, the wind outside grew harsher, the kind that shapes the snow into blinding sheets. Driving in that felt like begging for trouble, so I waited. I tried to keep busy, cleaning the kitchen, checking supplies, anything to give my mind something to hold on to. But even while moving around, I couldn't shake the sense that the lodge was paying attention to me. Every room felt charged, like the air was listening. When night finally settled, the storm built into a full whiteout. The windows rattled, the roof groaned, the lights dimmed in short, unsteady pulses. Every time it happened, my chest tightened a little more. I ended up in my room again, sitting on the edge of the bed with my boots still on, bag packed beside me. I kept telling myself I'd leave the moment the storm eased up, even if it was 3 a.m. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard the footsteps. Slow, careful. Moving down the hallway outside my door, they weren't heavy, but they weren't soft either, just steady enough that I could follow every step as it approached. My heartbeat felt uneven, skipping in this uncomfortable pattern I couldn't control. My breathing turned shallow, like my body was trying not to make any sound at all. The footsteps stopped right outside my room. No sound after that. Just stillness. I stared at the bottom edge of the door, waiting for a shadow. There wasn't one. But I could hear breathing again. Just barely, like someone trying to control it, standing inches from the door. My mind raced with possibilities. A hiker lost in the storm? Someone who'd taken shelter without me noticing? Some part of me wanted to believe that. But the breathing, it didn't sound right. It had this strange rhythm to it, almost too slow, like whoever it was didn't need to breathe the way a person does. When the lights flickered again, my pulse spiked so fast it made my vision blur. I reached for my bag, ready to run even if the storm would shred my visibility. But before I could stand, the breathing faded. Not like the person walked away, more like it just thinned out into the air until it wasn't there anymore. I waited 5 minutes, then 10. Then I grabbed my bag, opened the door, and stepped into the hallway. There were footprints, not snowy ones, just faint impressions on the old wooden floorboards, like someone barefoot had walked through dust that wasn't actually there. They led down the hall, then stopped in the middle, as if the person had simply disappeared. I didn't wait any longer. I left the lodge, storm or not. I don't even remember the drive, just headlights pushing through endless white, and the feeling that something was watching from the tree line the whole way. I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I hear those same footsteps again, slow, steady, moving toward wherever I'm sitting. And every time, I hold my breath, just to see if I hear someone else breathing in the room with me.